Südpol war niemand, es wird niemals sein, eine Erde, wo Juden können leben. Und kann auch sagen jetzt, mach einen Appell von dem kleines bisschen Juden, was sind ja in Polen, geht ja raus. Das ist kein Land für ihn zu leben.
What you have just heard are the sad words of Stanislaw Szmajzner, a Polish Jew who at the age of 16 brutally murdered Nazi guards in order to survive. Thanks to this, he found himself among the only 58 survivors of the fearsome Sobibor extermination camp. He knew torture and pain from a very young age, but they never managed to subdue him. On October 14, 1943, while still a teenager, he was part of a legendary revolt that pitted more than 600 prisoners against their captors in a dark day for the Third Reich. Both because of his survival instinct and his incredible testimonies, Stanislaw became a crucial piece in reconstructing the torments of Sobibor and demanding justice for the people who were annihilated there. Let's begin with this unique story full of horror and courage. Stanislaw Szmajzner was born in Pula, Poland, on March 13, 1927. His parents were Orthodox Jews, and he learned the trade of goldsmith from a young age, something that would later prove essential to his survival. In 1939, Germany invaded Polish territory, starting the Second World War and marking Stanislaw's childhood forever.
After defeating the Polish army, the Germans ruthlessly suppressed the Poles, whom they considered to be racially inferior. And in the weeks following the German attack on Poland, German SS, police, and military units shoot thousands of Polish civilians.
The Szmajzner family fled across Poland, hoping to elude the Nazi army. They ended up in Kazimierz, where they worked in a stable for a few months. However, starving, they moved to the city of Opole, where they were eventually captured. From there, on May 12, 1942, the first train departed for Sobibor. On board were the Szmajzners, along with 2,000 other Jews marching to extermination. The concentration camp had entered into service in April 1942, so at the time Stanislaw was sent there, it was in the middle of its activities. It was designed and built in the shape of a rectangle measuring 400 by 600 meters, surrounded by a 3-meter-high barbed wire fence. The location was convenient because it was in an isolated region and close to a major railroad that brought in new prisoners. The victims were unloaded at the train station and then transported to the camp itself by Ukrainian SS employees. What is surprising is that the first prisoners arrived under the promise of relocation to another part of Europe, which is why they carried bulky luggage as if they were moving.
German SS and police officials conducted deportations to Sobibor between May 1942, when the regular gassing operations began, and the fall of 1943. Most of the Jews brought to Sobibor were immediately gassed by carbon monoxide, which had been piped into the gas chambers from an engine.
Upon arriving at Sobibor, Stanislaw was not killed in the infamous gas chambers there, because he was an expert goldsmith and had brought his toolbox with him. The Germans felt that his knowledge would be of great use in the workshops. Thanks to this, he was also able to protect some of his relatives by insisting that he needed their help to complete the work. Over time, the SS officers were very pleased with his creations and decided to build him a small workshop to work in during the day. His main mission was to produce gold accessories for high-ranking German personnel, using materials stolen from prisoners. From coins to jewelry, and even dental pieces that were melted down to later form decorations for SS uniforms.
Die deutsche Wehrmacht hat sehr gerne gehabt, dass ich solle Goldsachen machen für diese. Und viele die Namen von den Leuten ausgravieren, Kugel von der Artillerie, habe ich die Namen von den Leuten gemacht.
In addition to these personalized bullets, the orders were incredibly design-wise. For example, Commander Gustav Wagner, the main point of reference for security and inspections at Sobibor, asked him for rings with runes, ornaments with skulls, and other National Socialist iconography. The most sinister thing that Stanislaw was entrusted with was gold tips for the whip of Kurt Bolender, the man in charge of whipping the prisoners punished inside the concentration camp. According to the Polish rebel, his job was key during the first months in that hellish place. I knew that work was the only guarantee we had. I worked day and night. It was about making myself indispensable, and everyone wanted things made of gold. Working in that makeshift workshop also allowed him to stay away from the harsh Polish climate, while reducing the possibility of physical torment and attacks on his relatives. In this way, some of the Szmajzner managed to survive for a while. Over time, the organizational leadership of Sobibor changed. Franz Stangl was put in charge of the operation of this industry of death and pain. So the meager benefits that the young man received from his goldsmith work were compromised. Stanislaw was assigned to general maintenance work and the production of mines to support the war effort of the Third Reich. This was a radical change, since this position gave him access to the most brutal areas of Sobibor, mainly to the section of gassing, murder, and cremation of the victims. The young man saw with his own eyes the gears of this relentless machinery that day after day annihilated hundreds of innocent people, many of whom he had known when he was a free boy in his hometown. Several years later, Stanislaw Szmajzner reflected on this deadly organization in which prisoners had to collaborate with the method of eliminating other inmates. We learned that from each transport, 50 strong men and boys were set aside to clean up after the cargo had been killed. The corpses were not yet cremated. They were buried in lime pits, and when they had finished cleaning, they were also killed. In later interviews, the man said that these visions remained forever in his mind. The feeling of proximity to death never left him.
Ich habe im Moment überhaupt nicht gewusst, was das Sobibor ist. Ich habe gedacht, dass vielleicht sind wir ein Arbeitslager, vielleicht sind wir auf einem zweiten Platz. Ich habe nicht gewusst überhaupt, wo ich bin hingekommen.
Stanislaw's notes were instrumental in reconstructing how work was done inside the concentration camp. He recalls that he was one of just 58 people who survived the infamous place. According to his memoirs, Ukrainian guards would take prisoners from the camp to do agricultural work, and, as they walked, lined up in columns one by one, they would force them to sing Nazi hymns. Gradually, the attitude of the guards became increasingly hostile, to the point where murders were carried out every workday for no apparent reason. About this, Stanislaw wrote, "One day I was helping with the garden work when an SS man named Karl Frenzel pulled out his revolver and shot the man next to me. To this day, I do not know the motive for this cold-blooded murder." The Sobibor camp was perfectly aligned with the Third Reich's norms regarding maintaining the basic needs of the prisoners so that they could work. The problem was that the German and Ukrainian guards were bored. That's when they became more sadistic, and to pass the time, they invented macabre games. One of them was to put a mouse from the sewer down someone's pants. If the victim moved, he was punished by flogging, using that gold-tipped whip built by Stanislaw. If you're wondering why the Ukrainians collaborated so directly with the Third Reich, the goldsmith has some answers for you.
Die Ukrainer waren ja Volksdeutsche. Ukraine.
Das waren keine richtigen Ukrainer, das waren deutsche
Die
Ukrainer.
größten Teile waren Volksdeutsche. Volksdeutsche sind Deutsche, was sind geboren und Ukrainer.
Ja.
Und es waren auch welche, was keine Deutsche waren nicht. Ukraine, was haben gesagt, dass sie sind Volksdeutsch, damit sie sich kann etwas leben, besser leben.
The guards' morbid sense of humor extended to inhuman limits, deceiving prisoners even in the moments before their execution. Jews who got off the train were guided to a shower room. Once there, officers assured them that they should clean themselves since they were going to travel to Ukraine to work in better conditions. Unfortunately, the bath was not with disinfectant, but with a mixture of chemical compounds that ended human life in an instant. In this, as in other concentration camps, the Germans were concerned with improving the logistics of mass murder in order to eliminate as many people as possible before it was necessary to remove the facilities. In Sobibor, for example, they built an extension of the railway that began just in front of the infamous showers and ended at the mouth of the oven in Camp 3. Within Nazi logic, this saved a lot of time when it came to transporting the dead from the chamber to the cremation site. When someone fell ill in the barracks, an officer would come over to ask how long the person had been in bed. If 2 days had passed, the patient was wrapped in a blanket and taken to Camp 3, the extermination complex. There was no room for weaklings or prisoners who could not produce goods for the Third Reich.
Wir haben niemals ja gewartet, dass wir wollen vielleicht eine Tage können durchleben das. Es war ja unmöglich. Niemand hat das gedacht, dass ich will das hier beleben. So ich wie der andere.
Stanislaw Szmajzner is known not only as a survivor, but as a fierce rebel who took part in one of the most incredible revolts of the entire Second World War. It all began with the arrival of a train loaded with prisoners, but this group was not made up of weak and defenseless civilians.
In September 1943, 20 Jewish Red Army prisoners of war, the soldiers who had the necessary expertise to pull off an escape, arrived at Sobibor on a transport from the Minsk ghetto and were selected for labor.
The human landscape of Sobibor had changed with the arrival of the new prisoners. Most of them well-trained, educated in communism, all strong, arrogant, and nonconformist. Their leader was the Jew Sasha Pechersky, son of a prominent Moscow lawyer. It was he who began planning the attack on the SS officers. Stanislaw's testimony describes it thus: "We were thinking of an uprising, but we lacked someone to promote it. No one better than Sasha to lead it. From that moment on, he would be our guide together with the Russian Jews who had proven military experience, which gave us unlimited confidence." On the Hebrew side, Sasha formed a resilient partnership with the Pole Leon Feldhendler, son of a rabbi. Both conspired in absolute secrecy because they thought that some cowards might betray them to the Germans. Sasha's initial suggestion was to dig a tunnel beyond the camp's barbed wire. They began to work on this task, but soon realized that there would not be time for all the prisoners to go through the shaft to freedom. In addition, heavy rain fell, collapsing the hole, so the idea was abandoned. Sasha and Leon then gathered the people they trusted, including Stanislaw, and ordered them to use all kinds of wood and metal to make weapons: knives, machetes, axes, and drills. On October 13, 1943, something significant happened that gave the final push to this revolt. Gustav Wagner, in charge of inspection and control of the barracks, was transferred to another camp. This greatly angered the rebels, as Wagner was an intelligent and perceptive man who had a habit of appearing unexpectedly in the most unpredictable places. His absence was a good sign. That same night word spread that they were to attack the next day, The plan was to lure the SS to places where different activities were taking place in Sobibor in order to eliminate several officers at once. Then, armed with firearms and keys, the prisoners would escape from the perimeter. Stanislaw was a key player in this. At just 16 years old, he was assigned a crucial task for the escape. Sneak into the weapons depot, remove the weapons, and provide the rebels with as many rifles as possible. Along the way, he had to eliminate every guard he came across to prevent the rest of the guards from giving the alarm ahead of time. He was the only one who could undertake this mission because he enjoyed special freedom to move around the camp due to his maintenance work. In addition, he had pliers capable of breaking the locks of the armory. This is how, without being seen by any guard, he managed to take several tools and 3 rifles, one of which he kept for himself. A Polish comrade of Stanislaw was tasked with monitoring the movements of the guards in Lager 2, while Sasha watched the officers in Lager 1. At the same time, a Czech electrician cut off the power in strategic areas. Meanwhile, another small group was tasked with collecting money and valuables to sell in order to survive in the outside world. After all, they would have to pay bribes and boat and plane tickets to escape the war zone in Europe.
Und genau bei dem Aufstand, ich, meine Brüder, meine Cousine, meine Schwestern, wir sind mit sehr viel Gold raus. So wie auch alle anderen Häftlinge sind raus. Gold und Schmuck und Geld und andere so Sachen, war keine Probleme in Sobibor. Weil wenn man tut ja jede Tage so viele Leute toten.
In the morning, the first part of the plan began, eliminating the guards patrolling the barracks area. A handful of prisoners contacted the SS officers, telling them that there was a problem in the area of the goldsmith's workshop and where the maintenance personnel were housed. There they were ambushed by the prisoners, who used their homemade weapons to kill them silently, either with blows to the head, axe blows, or knife blows to the neck, to avoid screams of pain. For a few seconds, the prisoners had the chance to massacre their captors in violent and savage ways. This gave them access to keys, weapons, and some important equipment with which they would attack the bulk of the camp's security when the workday began. When the morning call was made, the rebels, among whom was the young protagonist of this video, decided that it was time to advance. With the keys they had obtained and the few firearms they had gathered, they headed like an angry mob towards the main entrance of the camp. Along the way, they freed other groups of prisoners who were being held in different barracks throughout Sobibor. It was clear that not all of them would make it out alive, but the more rebels participated, the harder it would be for the guards to control the revolt. It was then that Stanislaw had his baptism of fire.
Szmajzner fired his rifle 4 times. One of the bullets hit one of the guards in the watchtower, who fell on the ground and was killed on the spot. It was the first time that Stanislaw had used a firearm.
During the chaotic escape, hand-to-hand fighting and gunfights broke out between prisoners and Germans. One of the most seasoned Nazis was Erich Bauer, the man in charge of the gas chambers. At the time the violence broke out, he was driving a transport truck. Taking advantage of the vehicle, Bauer opened fire with a rifle, killing several of the prisoners. Although the number of enraged prisoners emerging from the barracks was too great to be contained. One of the facts that was discovered thanks to Stanislaw's testimony was the active participation of Ukrainian guards in the hunt for prisoners. These second-rate employees brutally opened fire on the mob trying to escape from Sobibor. They used rifles and machine guns, which caused a very high number of deaths. The cartridges flew through the air amid screams of pain and fury. There was no real way to avoid death. The best thing was to run towards the gate, praying that none of the Ukrainian gunfire would get in the way. The escape was massive and chaotic. Much of the original plan went wrong, as there were more guards and security than expected, but still the prisoners' desire for freedom was an unstoppable fuel. It is estimated that, on that 14th of October 1943, around 600 people tried to escape from Sobibor. Due to the pile of bodies at the main entrance, many tried to climb the barbed wire. Some were completely caught between the metal edge, bleeding to death, unable to move forward. Others endured the pain and managed to jump over the barrier with their hands and legs lacerated, but with the immense joy of having achieved the first objective, stepping on the ground outside that extermination camp. At just 16 years old, young Stanislaw Szmajzner was able to evade security and kill several SS officers, slipping past lifeless bodies and blood-covered barbed wire. The terrain surrounding Sobibor was littered with mines that had been laid by the prisoners themselves. The safest way to get through was to use items such as rocks or pieces of wood to force the detonation of the more obvious mines, which had been placed only recently and whose shaft was still visible.
Stanislaw Szmajzner was lucky not to be in the first group to run, as many of those stepped onto mines and died, or got tangled up and died in the barbed wire.
An estimated 365 people managed to escape from the camp, and of that total, about half died in the stretch between the gates and the forest, either from the detonation of well-hidden explosives or from gunfire by guards trying to control the crisis. About 100 people managed to overcome all the deadly challenges and get lost in the wild nature surrounding Sobibor. To make the search more difficult, they split up into small groups that set off in opposite directions, seeking shelter in abandoned villages or friendly communities willing to hide rebellious prisoners. Despite the advice of his fellow prisoners, young Stanislaw Szmajzner broke away from the groups and decided to take charge of his own fate. During the war, he faced countless dangerous journeys across Poland. He stopped in small towns to earn a living as a goldsmith using a false identity, always avoiding areas with a strong Nazi presence. During this period, he discovered that his parents and siblings had been victims of the Holocaust, as had virtually all of his European relatives. The boy knew he had friends and cousins in Brazil, so he set out on the journey across the ocean. With the little money he had managed to save, he reached Italy and then embarked for Rio de Janeiro. In the South American country, he managed to establish himself and use his real name to denounce the dark acts of Nazism. The fight against the Third Reich continued for several years after the war. As one of the few survivors of Sobibor, his testimonies were important not only to reconstruct the activities in that extermination camp, but also to identify those responsible and prosecute them. In several articles and interviews, the goldsmith always stressed that the memories of that 1943 rebellion accompanied him always, until his last days. Finally, the brave Pole died on March 3, 1989, after seeing several Nazi leaders grow old behind bars. This way, we come to the end of the video. If you like this content, we invite you to subscribe and activate notifications for our channel. Without further ado, we say goodbye until the next installment of Military History. Thank you for joining us.